Hey guys, Paul here. So in today's video, I wanted to pose a question. Should a deck get hit on the ban list just because it's been around for too long? So this one's a fun one because, as you guys know, been playing Yu-Gi-Oh for a long time, been in this community a long time. The ban list comes, it goes, new archetypes come, they go. This weird dynamic that I've noticed though is players have a tendency to kind of expect decks to get hit after being meta relevant, competitively viable for a certain length of time. Even if the deck isn't necessarily overpowering, people still feel that deck should get hit. So what is a example of that? Well, I would say something like perhaps Tri-Brigade, right? Tri-Brigade came out in late 2020, and in its release, it wasn't really seen as like a super meta viable deck. As the sets, kind of came out, it got more support and eventually became a pretty powerful meta threat, thanks to mainly Tri-Brigade Bear Bloom, but also just, Tri-Brigade Revolt and Shurag cards that had been around for a little longer were now a lot more accessible and a lot more powerful, and the Tri-Brigade deck was very strong. And it stayed pretty strong just for its lifetime. Even today, it's still a pretty competent strategy despite getting hit a little bit on the ban list. But what you found with decks like that, and other decks of that age, things like Drytron's, Virtual World, even like the Dogmatica engine, people, 6-9 months after the decks kind of come out and become prominent, start to say things like, okay, when is this deck going to get hit? Because it's sort of become common for Konami to just hit decks on the ban list after they've been around for too long. But the thing that I wonder about with that is that necessarily like a good reason to hit a deck? And I don't think that there's a clear answer on it, so I'm just going to be sharing a few of my thoughts on it, and of course, I want to hear from you guys. So, when it comes to decks being competitively powerful, I don't think that there's anything wrong with the deck being strong or a card being strong. I've said this many times in the past, not all decks are made equal, some are going to be better than others. I think that's largely by design. I think Konami is very well aware when designing archetypes and things like that, what power level they sort of expect a deck to fall into. Obviously, I think they were aware that something like Tri-Brigade, something like Drytron would be, rather strong. Even now, as we get new archetypes like, say, Sword Soul, you can look at those cards and kind of tell, yeah, they probably intended for this to be a game-changing archetype, a game-changing theme. My question, though, is that right now, in its current state, I don't think that Sword Soul is particularly unfair, unbalanced. If you look at some of these early format, tournament results, it gets good representation, but rarely is it, an overwhelming amount. And now that Arch Nemesis Protoss has been banned, the deck doesn't actually have like a complete shutout floodgate, just built in that's like searchable and everything like that. It's still got very powerful boss monsters. It just got that new one in Battle of Chaos. And so my question then is, 6 months from now, if it's still, at top tables, winning some events, doing pretty well, will players just suddenly be like, okay, when are they hitting Sword Soul? When are they going to just go ahead and hit it? This conversation seems to always come up, and I sometimes feel like I don't really know if I agree with it. Like, just because Sword Soul's been around for a long time, if it's not like dominating the game, does that mean it should get hit? Maybe a more relevant example would actually be Alistair the Invoker. Now, I know, memes about normal summoning Alistair aside, Alistair is a very strong and impactful card on its own. It's certainly a high-value normal summon. But I think that there's not really ever been a point in time where Alistair has completely dominated the game or even been completely oppressive or won games single-handedly. That invoked engine is certainly infamous. I mean, nobody likes having to deal with a Mechaba, but I think most people would agree that as annoying as that whole thing is, it's not like unfair per se, right? Alistair is searchable, sure, by Magical Meltdown, but those are things that you can use Ash Blossom on, or you can Veiler on Alistair. I know sometimes they'll have Invocation anyway, great. They'll make Mechaba, and Mechaba is strong, but by today's standards, it's just sort of an average, middle-of-the-road sort of Omni-Negate card. They typically aren't even going to be able to negate traps, because a lot of people aren't running traps in decks that use Mechaba. And it costs a card from their hand. Most Omni-Negates like Crystal Wing or Borreload Savage are relatively free. So the Alistair engine on its own doesn't feel that broken to me. Now, sure, it can get really annoying when it's combined with things like, Shaddoll Schism and Winda, the Dogmatica engine with like Nadir Servant and stuff, and most recently DPE or Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer. These cards certainly make the strategy good, but I think a lot of people want the card like Alistair itself or Magical Meltdown or something to be limited on the ban list just because it's been, quote, around too long or it's overstayed its welcome. And I'm just not sure if that's really a good enough reason to hit a card. But on the other end of the spectrum, from I think Konami's perspective, it's in their best interests to hit cards like this when it allows the game to move forward. So there are just some themes in Yu-Gi-Oh! That don't really age, right? Like they will be pretty strong for just the duration of their lifespan. A pretty decent example might be Sky Strikers. Even though power creep is definitely a thing in Yu-Gi-Oh!, we can be fairly sure that if Sky Strikers did have 3 copies of Engage and all that stuff and like triple copies of say Hornet drones or whatever, that this deck would be a pretty powerful one with all of its cards. Multi-roll too, forgot to mention that. So with all those cards, and being at full power, I think Sky Strikers would more than dominate against today's top decks. That even includes, things like Sword Soul or Tri-Brigade. I still feel it would do really well against them. So it's for reasons like that that Konami probably just had to hit Sky Strikers. And it's not even that Sky Strikers in their prime were absolutely dominant. They certainly were strong. They certainly had good tournament showings. I don't think that anybody would say that it was outright just completely unfair. It could certainly, feel that way in a few games, but that's just because it was an upper tier deck. Almost every upper tier deck at the time had a few strong things it could do that maybe other decks couldn't. If you looked at, Salamangrace, they were recycling this counter trap. If you looked at Orchids, they were making Dingirsu and Your Turn and sending things and protecting stuff. If you looked at Thunder Dragons, they had Colossus. All these cards were strong, but sometimes I'm led to think that maybe they all got hit more so because they just they'd overstayed their welcome. They'd gotten their sort of year of relevance and it was time to move the game onwards. It seems though, like that's become something that a sentiment that the players now share too. Like I remember, let's say, if we were to rewind like maybe 10 years ago, I remember when Inzectors and Windups and all those decks first came out. This just feels like I'm walking down Yu-Gi-Oh! History lane here. But when those decks came out and Konami hit things like Plant Synchro, and I believe it was Six Samurai was one of the stronger decks before then, and that type of thing, those decks got hit and then these new decks came out and people were very upset because they're like, oh, you guys are just using the ban list to sell new product. And that's been a pretty common complaint players have had about Konami for many years. But it just seems like in recent years, people themselves, like players themselves, we tend to find ourselves asking Konami to just hurry and hit a deck because it's been around too long. And what is too long? Well, at that point, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, you could make an argument that maybe a deck should be relevant for 6 months. That's about 2 formats these days. Maybe 9 months, maybe a year. I mean, some decks have been relevant for like a year and a half or so, I'd say. Like in the Sky Striker example, they came out in middle of 2018 and didn't really get completely hit until the very beginning of 2020. So they lasted about a year and a half. But other decks didn't get quite as much time in the spotlight. I mean, if you look at something like Drytron, it's kind of been on and off. It did come out at the end of 2020, and so it got technically like a full year of relevance, but it's had like sort of mixed match times because Benton was limited for a while, but then Diviner came out. Then Eva got hit, and now Eva's banned, so technically like Drytron should be pretty much off the map. But I guess I'm just rambling at this point. My main question I want to pose is, do you feel that Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks sort of should have a shelf life? Competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks that are strong but not even necessarily dominating the game, should they just have a shelf life? Is there a point of time after which like a deck needs to get hit in order to make way for the new strategies? Even if the deck isn't being completely overpowering, is it just tiring? Should it just go? Decks like Invoked, decks like Dinosaurs for a long time. That was a big part of the conversation. And even with like these new decks like Sword Soul, will there be a time when you're just like, okay, I'm ready for Sword Soul to go, get it out of here, I'm ready for the next thing? What are your thoughts on that? I would love to hear it. Yeah, let me know. I'm interested in reading you guys' comments and knowing what you think. See you guys in the next one. Pass turn.